Hey everybody, this is the first video in a series of videos designed to help you as a gospel community leader understand Thessalonians a little bit better and maybe a few tips and ideas about how to communicate and get conversations going in your group about Thessalonians. Before I jump into this one, of course, there's the Bible Project video, which is fantastic. It does a great job showing you the themes and the structures. I think that video is like maybe 7 or 8 minutes long, so absolutely make sure you check that out. The other resources, the commentary that we recommended. Obviously, you guys have the study guide as well. This series is aimed to be a supplement to that. It's kind of like Mike's thoughts, if you will, on the letter to the Thessalonians, and hopefully you can find it helpful. So the first text that we're going to get into is chapter 1, verses 1 through 10. It's the only 10 verses in the chapter. And it's Paul's prayer. Again, to reference the Bible Project video, there's 3 prayers that kind of shape the Thessalonian letter and kind of reveals Paul's heart for them and for what he wants to see in them. And so if I was going to break this prayer down, I would use 3 C's just to try to help you remember a little bit of what's going on in there. Paul thanks God for their Christian character. He thanks God that God chose them, and it kind of confirms that they do belong to God. And he thanks God for their conversion and how that has, the story of their conversion has gone out in the surrounding areas. So those are the 3 things. Let's jump right in and look at the first one in chapter 1 and verse 2. Paul says he always gives thanks for these Thessalonian believers. He mentions to God and he remembers their character. And he mentions 3 things: faith, hope, and love. This is, if you were kind of going to the center of what Christian virtue is, faith, hope, and love would be really, really close to the center, probably love being the center. Paul uses it here. He uses it in chapter 4. Of course, he uses it in 1 Corinthians 13, famously, faith, hope, and love remain. The greatest of these is love. He uses it in Romans 13. So this triad, this group of 3, really are Christian virtues, and they, in a sense, manifest the authenticity of somebody's faith. And so when he thinks about the Thessalonians, he praises God. He thanks God that they give evidence of these virtues. And what's interesting, the way he talks about it here is there's an internal reality of the virtue, which, of course, we would connect to the idea of new creation, being made new, this internal transformation that takes place in the heart of a Christian. And then that internal reality, which is, again, distinctively Christian, fleshes itself out in something observable and visible. So he says that he thanks God for their work of faith. And the best way to understand that is a work that comes or originates from their faith. They have faith in Jesus Christ, and that faith manifests itself in works of love and service. Think James 2. Faith without works is dead. On the positive side, a genuine faith will produce works. Then he says that they have labor from love. Again, there's some type of work that the Holy Spirit really has done to produce love in the heart. And then that love that they feel in a spiritual realm is manifested in the physical realm in how they serve and give. And we'll see that later in the letter. And the last one is that they have this steadfastness or this endurance that comes from their hope. As we'll see, talking about how God chose them and their conversion, when they became Christians, they experienced a significant amount of affliction, like persecution, being ostracized, being marginalized. Some people think they were martyrs. I'm not so sure about that, but he does talk about people that have died, and that's why some people speculate that. But there was persecution for sure, to the point where Paul and Silas actually fled the city. And yet they remained, they endured. Why? Because they had this internal hope that had been born in them by the Spirit. And so even though things in this life were difficult, they had hope for the future, and that caused them to endure. So when you think about Christian virtue, faith produces works, love produces labor, and hope produces endurance. And he thanks God for them. And so, in your group, it'd be great, to have a conversation about, what is Christian virtue? Maybe contrast that with, what are some of the cultural virtues around us? But what makes Christian virtue distinct? How do we get it? What does it produce? And then be grateful to God when you see that. There's so many things that we can thank God for. We ought not to overlook the fact that any type of virtue or goodness that we have in our lives, we ought to deflect that praise back to God, because the faith, hope, and love that they had didn't originate with them. It came from God. The second kind of theme that I would say that comes out in this prayer is verse 4. Paul says, "For we know, brothers, loved by God, that he has chosen you." And so he's thankful for their character, and he knows that that character comes from Christ because they've been chosen by God. Now, of course, this issue of being chosen or election certainly can be a sticky issue at some time, and in your group, I certainly wouldn't promote a big debate about this issue, free will versus election and that kind of thing. But it's just worth reading it out loud and recognizing that some aspects of election are a mystery, but some aren't. And this one's not necessarily a mystery. Paul says, listen, I know God chose you, not because he sent me a divine telegram, but because when God works and initiates his presence into people's lives, again, you can observe the fruit of it. You can see transformation and change that happens, which again references back to their character, but specifically he cites the evidence that their conversion was real, and we'll talk more about their conversion in the third C, but the evidence is that they received the gospel and the gospel worked. Lots of people hear the gospel, but they aren't changed by it. And the people that are changed by it, what's the explanation? Well, the people are more spiritual, they're more open, they're more... No, the reason that Paul gives here that he's grateful to God is that when he preached the gospel, they responded even though they were experiencing persecution, and Paul recognizes that that must be God's work in their life, authenticating them, and he gives praise to God for it. And so, it's worth, again, maybe in your group, just talking about maybe hearing people's stories. It's a great thing to do. And just, talk about when did you hear the gospel, and how did that work in your life, and what were you thinking or feeling? And then to tie those things back and say, you know what? That was God seeking and pursuing you. That was God initiating his love and his grace and his mercy into your life. And, sharing your stories back and forth, and then giving praise to God. So when Paul is writing this letter to this church, he's thanking God for God's work in their life. He sees it in their character, and he knows that God has chosen them because of the way that they responded to the gospel when he preached it. Now, to kind of push that a little bit further, but a little bit distinct, is let's just talk for a minute here about their conversion. And this is down in verse number 9. He says, "For they themselves," this is the people surrounding Thessalonica, there are other churches and other places that heard about them, "they gave a report about the Thessalonian church of the kind of reception we had among you, how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come." And so he describes, this is one of the great conversion passages actually in the New Testament. What does it mean to be converted? It means to turn from something to God, to serve and to wait for his coming. And so, that's a fantastic little way to understand conversion. They were polytheistic, worshiping many gods, had the same value system as the culture around them. And when they received Paul, they talked about the reception that Paul received. When Paul came and preached in Thessalonica, something significant happened. They rejected the cultural value system, the many gods that they had grown up with and they were accustomed to. They turned away from those things, which are considered to be dead idols and worthless. They rejected those things, and they turned to God, the living God, the Jesus who's been raised from the dead, and they are enduring and waiting and looking for his return. And so, that is a wonderful explanation of what conversion is. And their conversion had left an impact
on that whole region. I mean, when you read in verse 8, the word of the Lord has sounded out from them in Macedonia and Achaia, gone forth everywhere. So that Paul didn't need to say anything about these Christians. Lots of people had heard about how they had turned from all these idols and had given themselves to the Lord. That's also a really interesting way to see a corporate witness. It's not necessarily that all of the Christians in this church, in a sense, became evangelists that left the city. It's that the church as a whole, its being and its speaking and doing, became a witness to God's presence in that city. And so that's what we want to be. We want to be known as people who, on the one hand, reject the cultural values and worship system of our day. And we want to call people to God, to turn to God, to Christ, to serve him and to wait for him. And when Paul thought about their life, man, he was really grateful for that. And so again, it's probably worth, in your group having a conversation about, what genuine conversion is, and again, kind of going back to how you've experienced that, and then how we as a church, or maybe you specifically in your group, could become a corporate witness, individual and corporate witness, to the Lord, to the risen Christ and his return. So 3 C's in this prayer. He is thankful for their Christian character. He is thankful for the fact that God had chose them and initiated this love that was evidenced by how they received the gospel. And the way that they had received the gospel is through conversion or through repentance that led to a changed lifestyle even in the midst of affliction. So some thoughts for you there. I hope you enjoyed the first video. More to come.